Giving today's chapel talk is Dr. Cook. Bill Cook is a visiting professor of religion and history and has held that rank from 2008 to 2010. He retired last May after 42 years of teaching in the history department of the State University of New York at Geneseo with the rank of distinguished teacher professor. He is a specialist in church history, especially the medieval and Renaissance periods. He has written 4 books about St Francis of Assisi and the order he founded. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Wabash, class of '66, and a brother of Lambda Chi Alpha. He holds an MA, NA, and PhD from Cornell and was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters from Wabash in 2010. He is single and has adopted several children. One of them is a member of the Wabash College class of 2007 and a member of Kappa Sigma. Giving his talk cleverly titled, Wabash in My Mind, Dr. Bill Cook.
Some of you may know that one of my teaching specialties is the Divine Comedy of Dante. So today, I want to be Dante. We all have these fantasies as academics. We all want to be who we teach. And what I want to do is tell you a story. It's essentially my story, but if I'm good at being Dante, it's also your story. Because although our stories in all their details and all their surface elements are quite different from one another, 1966, when I graduated, was a very long time ago and a very different time. Nevertheless, I hope you will hear in my story elements of your own, with your own details to describe them. And also, since I'm a bit further down the path of life than you are, about 50 years, I hope that you will also hear something of perhaps what might your life be like after you leave Wabash. So I hope that it is my story, your story, our story. I'm an only child from a middle-class family in Indianapolis. Neither of my parents had a traditional college education. I grew up like most kids of my generation in a World War II housing tract. Brand new house where everybody's dad was a World War II veteran in the neighborhood. It was an all-white neighborhood. And except for my 4 years at Indianapolis Tech High School, I lived in a pretty much all-white world. I was a political junkie. In fact, I claimed that in 1952 I owned more I Like Ike buttons than any other living human being. And I think that might be true. Unfortunately, they're still in my damn basement. I had an eventful childhood. I did not know it, but the most important event of my childhood took place in March of 1954. I was at the Milan-Muncie Central basketball game that became the game on which Hoosiers was based. I know 10,000 and 10 million people claim to have been there. I actually was. I can show you the seat. I grew up at Trinity Episcopal Church and was a pretty good member of the choir. In fact, one of my choir boyfriends turns out to be the grandfather of a member of the class of 2014 here. At Tech High School, I went from being a super nerd to a kind of semi-nerd that at least allowed me some role in student government. I was smart, I had good grades, I did all the usual high school things, I went to high school dances and even negotiated with an incredibly old principal to allow us to have a sock hop at Tech High School. I was a radical. I learned about Wabash first by accident. As a member of the Tech Student Council, I was assigned one of the college visitors that came to Tech. And the person I was assigned to was Carol Black from Wabash College. So I took him off to the room in which he was to interview young men all day long, and nobody came. I was a sophomore, but he spent the entire day out of desperation recruiting me. At the end of my junior year, I came for a visit to Wabash for the first time, and I met a young admissions counselor who had just been out of college a couple years, a guy named Fred Scott, later on a member of the Board of Trustees. And Fred Scott was smart, and he was funny, he was sophisticated, and I thought, if Wabash turns out people like Fred Scott, I think this might be a place I want to go. Knowing some of the admissions counselors, including one very well, I think that same principle is still working at Wabash College today. And so I arrived at Wabash in September 1962 and came into the chapel for what was then Freshman Sunday. I had already pretty well figured out my life. This is what it was going to be like. I was going to major in political science, become a lawyer, and become a Republican member of the Indiana State Legislature. I was going to have a traditional family, which I looked up and discovered meant 2.5 children and a house with 1 3/4 garages. And I was going to be an active Episcopalian. And then I came to Wabash. On Freshman Sunday, President Byron Trippett spoke to us. He was movie star handsome. He was brilliant. He had suave oozing out of every pore. Of course, he was a beta. That helped for a start. And ultimately, I don't remember any of the words Byron Trippett said, but it occurred to me sitting there on Freshman Sunday, and it occurred to my parents as well, if I do well at this place, I could actually be a little bit like Byron Trippett. I could hardly imagine anything better, and that's still true 50 years later. I moved into a fraternity house like everybody else pretty much did on Freshman Sunday. I moved into the Lambda Chi house, not a clue what fraternities were or how this really weird system worked. I hung around for a couple days, not much happened, and finally, the last night before something had to happen, I got a pledge pin. Later on, having been involved in other of these activities, I know why I got a pledge pin. I could write a check every month to pay for my food and board and room in the house, and I had pretty good grades, and well, it always helps to have a pretty good GPA. I don't think I impressed anybody very much, but at least I was a check because the Lambda Chi house had expanded at the time and needed warm bodies, and I did measure 98.6. And that was pretty much good enough. And I felt pretty good about that. I was at Wabash College, and I had a pledge pin, and pretty damn cool. And after the first day of classes, we had an assembly. It was actually called a lineup. I'm trying to dignify this. And one of the seniors got up and said, "Gentlemen," looking at all 24 of us pledges, and Lambda Chi did have pledges then, "Gentlemen, don't overinterpret. Gentlemen," they said, "we were very impressed by your high school grades, by how many high school offices you held, by how many athletic teams you were on. Gentlemen, we are no longer impressed." And I thought, shit, what have I gotten into? This scared the hell out of me. This was the first time in my life when people told me they weren't impressed by me. A lot weren't, but they didn't tell you that. And this was a very scary moment. In fact, all of pledge training and all of the general freshman hazing was puzzling and occasionally painful. One time I was walking downtown, and some smart-ass townie, I like to hope he's alive today and I find him, with all of you guys right behind me, I might add, rode by me on his bicycle and stole my freshman pot. The little hat we had to wear, the ones that Phi Delts still wear, we had to have those little hats on all the time, or very bad things, I was told, could happen to us. And now I'm in downtown Crawfordsville, exposed to the world, and my head doesn't have a green and red pot on it. It took me 5 miles to get back to the Lambda Chi house. I went down alleys, I snuck around trees, I did not want anybody to see me, and I finally got in the back door safely. It was quite an experience. But of course, Wabash isn't about pledging, and it isn't about being a Rhine, which is what all freshmen were called in those days. It's about education. And it didn't take me very long to realize that Wabash was very serious about my education. We had a required freshman course called A History of Contemporary Civilization, the kind of predecessor of C&T. And my freshman CC teacher was a brand new professor, just like me, young, exciting, interesting. In fact, he's sitting here today. It's Professor Jim Barnes, a man who deserves your applause. And we had much more than in C&T. We had a lot of large lectures. And it was really the cream of Wabash's extraordinary crop who gave those lectures. Jack Charles and Vic Powell and Hall Peebles, names you probably heard. And it was extraordinary to hear these people get up and lecture and to be led into some very tough questioning in our so-called quiz sections by Jim Barnes, a man with modest credentials, you know, Phi Beta Kappa from Amherst, Rhodes Scholar, Harvard PhD. Aren't they a dime a dozen? And I remember, since Jim Barnes was my advisor, walking into his office one day for a chat, which was in Forest Hall, which is a building that since has been on wheels more than once. It used to be over there, and now it's over there. But at any rate, we had a conversation, and he was getting to know me and asking the kinds of questions you ask freshmen. And I started complaining about the fact that my eyesight wasn't very good. And I realized I was talking to a person with no eyesight. And that was a startling moment for me. I actually had to listen to myself and listen to how poorly I observed the world around me. And so I decided to take corrective action. And so I did an experiment. It's not like a Wabash kind of thing to do. When most people were not around, I would walk around the Lambda Chi house with my eyes closed to try to understand what it was like to be Jim Barnes. And I would sort of feel my way along the wall and count the steps and whatever. And I sort of thought I had it down until one day I bumped into something I wasn't expecting, and of course I immediately opened my eyes to see what it was. And I realized that you can't be somebody else. You can't fully experience that. You have to learn about it, observe it, consider it, but we also have to learn about the limits of how we can learn and what we can learn, and to recognize the fact that we simply cannot be somebody else. It's hard enough being ourselves. I had an English course with Bob Harvey, and one of the things he did, since he was also the archivist of the college, was once a week we would break in a small group, just 3 or 4. We would go in the archives, sit in comfortable chairs, and talk about good books. And I had no idea that could be so pleasant, that that could give such a high degree of pleasure. These are 18-year-olds, you know, from all the towns of Indiana and beyond, sitting around talking about T.S. Eliot and talking about Hamlet and talking about a lot of other important and interesting works. And I just never knew that that kind of learning and that kind of sharing of learning and ideas could be so pleasurable. Of course, I came to chapel because I didn't have any choice. And I can remember 2 chapel speeches from my freshman year. One of them was by a visitor to the college named Herb Philbrick, about whom there had been a TV series made. He had been a sort of fake communist. That is to say, he had joined the Communist Party, but he was really working for the FBI. And because he was only a family man, he was known for his book and TV series, I Led 3 Lives. And one of the professors, a young philosophy professor, and a couple others were outside picketing him because he was really sort of that bizarre, sort of cold warrior. And I thought to myself, they shouldn't do that. That isn't polite. Picketing is something you do in some other part of the country, maybe Berkeley or something. Do that. Just not, really, should we do? Indianapolis Star made a big deal of this, and it did not compliment this professor and the student for speaking out. But I began to realize again that some of the conventions in which I'd been raised, even certain kinds of conventions of politeness, perhaps are not quite the right response. I had to consider a larger range of possibilities than I had before. I also remembered a speech by Ben Rogie, as in Ben Rogie Lounge. You know you're old when things that you know as buildings or pieces of buildings I know as people. That's my definition of old. But Ben Rogie stood here and said, the kind of faculty we want at Wabash College are faculty who are driven to teach, faculty who wouldn't be satisfied doing anything else. And I looked around at the faculty I had, and they seemed to fit that criterion, as they do in 2013. You gentlemen are blessed more than you know. Just travel around a lot of other colleges and see how many professors don't appear to be driven to teach. They may be driven to research or driven to lots of other things, but Wabash College still hires men and women now, of course, who are driven to teach. My second semester I thought would be easy until during a frivolous moment at the Lambda Chi house, I broke my arm. No details. I was taking biology. Do you know how hard it is to dissect a frog one-armed? I do. And I had another one of those legendary Wabash professors, Elliot Williams, whom we fondly called Bugsy, because that's what he studied. And he was sort of an old army type, a tough guy. And my technique for the frog was, I had a little box full of implements, and I would put it on the leg of the frog, and then I would put my cast down on the box to hold the frog, and then I would saw away with my left hand. Elliot Williams walks by. One of the people watching across the desk is a fellow named Dave Kendall, a friend of mine who later on became a Rhodes Scholar. And Elliot Williams said, "God damn it, Cook, that's the messiest frog I've ever seen." I was like, give me a break. I got the arm. No, never mind. Wabash was a tough place. Okay? It didn't put up with mediocrity, even if that mediocrity seemed to have as one of its causes a frivolous night at the Lambda Chi house. I also took a course with a fellow named Dick Strawn, who taught French, but also a course in linguistics. And we did the most extraordinary thing. We spent the entire semester with one of our African students, and we had to learn his tribal language without speaking to him in English. So we had to act out things, and here's a trick, if I do this and say, what is this? Well, he might say cheek, he might say bone, he might say skin, he might say white. How do I know which one of those things I'm pointing to as he understands it? But over the course of the semester, we had to figure out the grammar and some of the vocabulary of this language. To this day, it was one of the most important and challenging intellectual experiences of my life, and I'm still only 19 years old. I'm now 69 years old. I remember it very well, and not recently I ran into Dick Strawn, who's still doing well and living in Crawfordsville. The first summer, between my freshman and sophomore years, that is, I went on the first Wabash College Glee Club overseas. Do you know what it's like? And the answer is yes, many of you do. To go to some place after you've just studied it at Wabash College. You gentlemen know that because that's been institutionalized as the immersion course. But this was a new thing at Wabash in 1963. And I took Roman history the second semester of my freshman year, and then, thanks to Wabash College, I got to go to Rome. It was unimaginably wonderful and different than going to some place that I really hadn't studied at Wabash College. I'd taken a course in Roman history. I had not taken anything on Dutch or Belgian history. So the Roman experience was so wonderful because I could use the knowledge I had from that course and see it in a way I couldn't have seen it as a tourist, or even seen it in a way I couldn't see other parts of the world that I was visiting. And the other good thing about the Glee Club trip was, especially because I wasn't on an athletic team, this was the first time I really got to spend a lot of time with non-Lambda Chis. Even Wabash can become a very divided up place, as we all know, and we all need some sort of outlets where we experience the entire college population outside as well as inside the classroom. And yet, when I went home from that Glee Club trip, let me tell you what I did that summer. I hung out with my old high school buddies, and every Thursday diligently went to see a Three Stooges movie. I hadn't quite gotten all of what Wabash was about, even after 1 year. I also had to deal with a phone call where one of my pledge brothers was killed in an automobile accident. Another one of those startling moments, because after all 18-year-olds sort of feel themselves and all their colleagues to be invincible. As a sophomore, I sat at the round tables in the Scarlet Inn, which freshmen couldn't do because a lot of faculty sat there, and I got to mingle with the faculty. And I got to know faculty whom I never had in class, as well as those that I did. And that was quite an experience. And yet, I'd been at Wabash almost a year and a half, and my worldview was still pretty narrow. How narrow was it? I walk into Scarlet Inn in the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. The woman behind the counter, and I was a usual inn person, so she knew me, said, "Have you heard the news? The president's been shot. The president's been shot." And I said, "Who would want to shoot Byron Trippett?" Think about that. I had a pretty small view of the world because, of course, that was the assassination of JFK. I took a medieval history course with Professor Charles that met in the basement of this building, in fact, because there was a classroom down there in those days. And beginning at that moment, I said, I think I'd like to do this for the rest of my life. I didn't say that about the political science course I was taking, although I was still a political science major, but there was something about that course that grabbed me. It didn't grab all the people around me, necessarily, but it grabbed me. And by golly, I'm still at this medieval history stuff all these years later. I had a chemistry professor named Ed Hainish, known to every student by one name, Big Ed. And he was big in every possible way. And I can still remember him when you answered a question wrong in Phys Chem. He would raise his fist. He would, I thought, attack furniture in a way that was unfair. Gentlemen, it just ain't so. I never wanted to speak again when he said that to me. That was so scary to me that he would just call us out. He did not tolerate dumb answers. He did not tolerate lack of preparation. And by golly, after I got one of those fists, I was always prepared. I wasn't always right, but I was always prepared in Phys Chem. And I had a professor in political science named Carl Olesker. And he was doing the damnedest thing while he was teaching me political science. He was running for the United States Congress. And to have a political science professor who's out there in the field talking to farmers and wheeling, dealing with the party and whatever was a wonderful experience. It gave us an insight into political science far beyond the books we were reading or far beyond what other professors could give us. And after that year, I went home and I hung out with Wabash friends and read books all summer, even books that weren't in English. Wabash had finally gotten to me. I'd finally begun to get it. I came back as a junior, and one of my fondest memories is we had an African student here, and he was told in the week of the bell game, you go out and stop those Dannies any way you can. The dean had to tell him that he really couldn't use the blowgun he brought with him from Africa. Absolutely true. That year, one of Wabash's great men, Dick Ristine, was a candidate for governor of Indiana. He lived right across the street from the campus. And Dick Ristine lost that election. And our Glee Club director calls us all up and says, get over to Ristine's house. And we sang Wabash songs to him on his porch just after he had conceded defeat in the election. When he died a couple years ago, I chatted with his widow and I introduced myself and I said I was there on the lawn that night. She said, you know, we have never forgotten that. That's always been something that was deep in Dick's heart and her heart. Who would have guessed just a bunch of guys singing a couple songs out in the lawn could have such a big impression? I also, as a junior, had some other interesting things happen. I took Eric Dean for religion. I've been raised an Episcopalian. I had somewhat fleetingly gone to the Episcopal Church in Crawfordsville, but I was having, shall we say, a non-religious life. Eric Dean taught me that Christianity could be and should be taken seriously, how it could be discussed, how it could be thought about, what its profound depths were. A life-changing experience. So was one I had from a rookie professor named John Fisher. He got way behind in the syllabus, and when the exam came, we assumed that all the material on the exam would be stuff we'd done in class. That turned out to be a false assumption. I got back my exam, and it had a grade that I hope you've never even heard of. I had an F+. Later on, he explained to me, he said, Cook, F+ wasn't a grade, it was an insult. You learn from these experiences. John Fisher and I have been friends ever since. Being a senior was wonderful because, of course, unlike all of you, I was at the bell game. After 9 years of either losing or tying, in my senior year, first we stole the bell, And then we won it. And that was one of the most exciting moments. I'm sure you've all heard the great story of the bell theft. And although I confess not to being a part of it, since it was my class, by golly, you have to take some sort of collective credit. I wrote a senior research paper for Professor Barnes. And it was good. But of course, it took a couple all-nighters to get it done. And so in my pajamas, I come over to his office to slide the paper under the door. Wouldn't you know it, he was there. So I walked in, sort of quietly handed the paper, Professor Barnes, here's my paper, bye. And he said, well, since you're here, sit down and read it to me. I didn't want to sit down and read it to him. I wanted to go to sleep. And I knew what it meant to read a paper to Jim Barnes. It meant about every fourth word I would be asked for the citation and the explanation and whatever. It was a long read. A very good experience, and I have forgiven him for that. I took colloquium, where I learned how to pick yourself off the floor after you've said something really stupid. It's a very useful thing to know. I, by accident, was on the Monon Railroad one time sitting next to Professor Lou Salter, whom I had never had in class, but whom I knew from the Scarlet Inn. This was in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. And being a kid from Indiana, I didn't think much about it. I wasn't much concerned about it. And somehow we got on the topic. And Lou Salter, with the quiet passion that was Lou Salter, really showed me how insular and wrong I was about some things. And a couple months later, at the Lambda Chi house, during the break when we had a lot of high school seniors there, we had a big dispute in our house because one of the people that some wanted to pledge wasn't white. He was Chinese. At this time, all the fraternities, except the Teeks, only had white students. Hooray for the Teeks. But at any rate, we therefore had a debate because the students in the Lambda Chi house who didn't want blacks saw that this Chinese fellow was a gateway to blacks. And we had a fairly rigorous argument about it. And I knew how to argue on this issue because of that conversation I'd had with Lou Salter. He had showed me what it meant to believe in racial justice and equality. And by golly, myself and a few other guys won that fight. Dr. Frank Ling is one of our most illustrious alumni. And the Lambda Chi's broke the color barrier. Barely, but it broke the color barrier. And that was an exciting thing. Another exciting thing was that in a religion class we had for 2 weeks here a bishop from England who had written a best-selling book called Honest to God. And for 2 weeks with our religion class, he met with us, we debated and discussed really important things, and I left understanding that it's possible to be a modern person, think in terms of the modern world, and to be a Christian. Because so often those things in traditional churches and whatever seem like they're sort of always clashing against each other. I learned it need not be so. One of my last memories of Wabash was one of my fellow seniors spoke in chapel. It was a tradition. And he describes a lot of the things that we did at Wabash. You know, gentlemen, we sit around and we talk about important things and you go to colloquium and so on. It really sounded good. And then he said, gentlemen, let's face it. Most of that is simply intellectual masturbation. I'm guessing that was the first time masturbation had ever been said at this podium. But you know, by golly, he was sort of right. That is to say, a certain number of things we do where we sort of pretend we really are suave and sophisticated really is a kind of intellectual self-pleasuring. It becomes all about us rather than all about what we're talking about. Well, I want to tell you, I graduated and we all went our ways. Let me tell you where we went. My pledge brothers and roommates became a lawyer, a doctor, a social worker, a CEO, an advertising exec, an airplane pilot, medieval historian, not just me, a physicist, a mathematician, a baseball executive, a label writer, a victim of the war in Vietnam, and a non-functioning alcoholic. Unfortunately, my pledge son. But all of them are friends of my lifetime. Wabash is not a 4-year experience, as you know. I became quite a different person than I was when I came to Wabash, although not during those 4 years and not right away. For example, I didn't become a lawyer. I went to graduate school in medieval history, got a PhD, and became a professor. I did not remain a Republican. I became a Democrat in the 1990s, and I actually, like Carlo Lesker, ran for the US Congress. And I might add, like Carlo Lesker, lost. I'm not a Protestant. I converted to Roman Catholicism in the 1970s, remaining respectful of the tradition from which I came, and often critical of my own new affiliation. I didn't get married, and I'm not even lily white anymore because I adopted children who are African American, Puerto Rican, Korean, and Vietnamese. It's one strange family. I doubt that most of these changes would have occurred if I had not attended Wabash and been challenged at every turn, broadened from that smart but narrowly focused Indianapolis kid, expected to be creative, expected to take risks. But it's not the changes I made in my life that are important. It's the fact that those changes came as a result of continuous self-examination. Socrates, I think it's fair to say, is right. The unexamined life is not worth living. Actually, I can't testify that because after Wabash, I couldn't ever live an unexamined life. Long before Wabash's mission statement appeared on the web, my classmates and I learned about thinking critically, acting responsibly, leading effectively, and living humanely. Last week in a wonderful chapel talk, Professor Wysocki, who's, only, sort of a half-century younger than I am, helped us all to understand and expand our understanding of our great slogan, Wabash Always Fights. It'll never be, if it ever was, just an athletic cheer again. We Wabash men live continuously struggling. As she was speaking last week, I thought of words of Teddy Roosevelt. He writes that the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again. And just 2 weeks ago at chapel, I began to reflect on my Wabash education in a new way thanks to Professor Wetzel, who taught us that Wabash prepares us for a life of continuing disturbance. Well, Professor Wysocki, I have erred and returned to the arena. Professor Wetzel, I've encountered many disturbances in my life, and I expect to err again and return once again to the arena, and I expect more disturbances. Gentlemen, you better expect that sort of life because you chose to be Wabash men. It's a hell of a ride. It's a bumpy ride to be a Wabash man for the next 60 and 70 years, but it's a great ride. Be thankful for it and relish it. It is a privilege you've chosen. It's a privilege you've earned. It's a privilege you now need to live out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. I have just a few brief announcements. First of all, TGIF will be at Phi this week. Tonight is senior night for our wrestling team in Chadwick. It starts at 6:30. Please be there. Friday, track and field will be at Indiana University. Saturday, track and field will be at DePaul University. Basketball will be playing Kenyon College here at 3. And today, right at the conclusion of chapel, Theta Delta is raising money for the Special Olympics through a polar plunge, and will be collecting their donations at the back of chapel. Please rise and sing Old Wabash.
From the hills of main to western plain, where the cotton's flowing, who shared